could see some seniors having a very low income that haven't already paid their mortgage off.
Sure.
And not having it,
Mm-hmm.
that might explain the low cost burden down there.
All right, and then this is just taking that chart and flipping it into percentages. So, generally speaking, there's going to be higher percentage of cost burdened households at the lowest income thresholds. So, generally you're gonna see sort of a downward trend here. I think the sort of takeaway in terms of looking at the data in aggregate is that of all households that are cost burdened to some degree, 61% are renters, and then renters comprise 70% of all severely cost burdened households. But then same point applies here. You know, we certainly can break this apart into a renter and owner chart, so it's a little bit easier to follow. All right. Okay. So kind of going into what is the existing affordable supply within Shorewood. So there's sort of two components to affordable housing. The first is mandated supply, and then the second is naturally occurring supply. So mandated supply within Shorewood is extremely limited. Essentially, there are two properties, and by mandated meaning it's subject to some kind of federal or local program that imposes rent and or income restrictions on people that reside there. So the largest property is River Park. It's a project-based Section 8 development, age-restricted, 427 units, all one bedroom. I think they're 550 square feet. Nearly 100% occupied, fairly lengthy waiting list. That is very typical for a Section 8 senior property just about anywhere in the country. It's very rare you would see a Section 8 property with more than 3 or 4% vacancy. The other property is a conventional property that also has 17 units that are restricted to households earning 60% of the area median income or below. General tenancy property. The 17 units that are restricted are essentially identical to the market rate units at the property. It's 100% occupied with more than 500 households on the waiting list. And that's really it as far as units that are formally restricted. So then the second sort of component is what we call naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA. Sometimes you'll see the acronym within the housing industry. It's sort of a controversial topic in some communities, and the reason being the way that naturally occurring affordable housing basically happens is that you have older housing stock within a community that basically, particularly in communities where maybe for a long time that's sort of been like the only available rental supply, and then you have new higher end market rate that enters into the community and basically puts downward pressure on those units, and those units can't effectively compete with brand new construction. They just can't. I mean, maybe if you renovate, do a substantial renovation, you could maybe approach, what that new product is getting, but generally that older, 1970s product is not gonna compete with 2018 construction. So basically, the only way that housing can effectively compete is some downward pressure on price point. So that's why in most markets you would see that older housing, particularly housing that hasn't been updated, tends to rent at a lower amount than something that's brand new. It's just kind of basic economics. The problem is that housing, although it can then be, because of the downward pressure on rent, can then be affordable to lower income households, but it's not required to be affordable to lower income households. So essentially, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit with the demand analysis, what oftentimes happens is that you have households at higher income levels renting in those units as opposed to tenants that might have a, quote unquote, more appropriate income match with those units. That said, I mean, this phenomenon occurs everywhere. Some communities, have kind of taken this concept and then we'll refer to that housing sometimes as naturally occurring workforce housing, because that's essentially what this supply ends up being. But The reason I say it's controversial is simply because of the fact that if that is sort of the sole source of your affordable housing supply, you oftentimes end up with a gap in terms of higher income households tending to rent those units, and then lower income households not being able to essentially access that affordable housing.
That would seem pretty prevalent here in the village. I mean, all the apartments on Oakland and Capitol, those, I mean, what are those built in the 30s, 40s, 50s? All the big, the 3-4 story walk-ups.
Some 20s, yeah.
Yeah, some of them.
Estabrook Homes comes to mind in that grand scheme of thing.
Yeah,
Because it's-
right. It would seem like we have a lot of units that kind of fit that, because that was always my feeling, you know. And I own properties and I'm always watching the market, and Shorewood always seemed affordable in terms of pricing when I would see, you know, apartments put up for rent on Craigslist and other places. But the affordable units are generally the ones in the buildings that are getting on to 80, 70, 80 years old. I've never actually been in them, so I don't know exactly what they're like inside. But I think to your point, you're just saying that even though the rents are low, it's controversial because you're not actually restricting who can live there.
Right. Anyone could live there. So someone with a considerably higher income, so that maybe would then just be paying, 10% of their income toward rent. Not that there's anything per se wrong with that. It just results in there being gaps in the supply.
What? Never mind.
That's okay.
I don't want to go down that road right now. We have a lot
So,
of questions about
to kind of speak to your point about the prevalence of this in Shorewood, so what we kind of did is stacked. So these are the traditional apartment communities that we surveyed, rental properties within Shorewood. And we basically just stacked the rents to see, okay, for a studio 1, 2, 3 bedroom, where do these rents fall? And then what we sort of included in there as reference is the yellow bar is for a tax credit property, the maximum rent that they could charge at 60% AMI. And then the green bar is the maximum tax credit rent you could charge at 80% AMI. So any property falling beneath those thresholds would technically be, would be quote unquote affordable by a federal program. And they're effectively renting below those limits.
And
But
what's the orange?
the orange is the Light Horse property, what they're actually charging for their 60% units. They're not quote unquote tax credit, so there are different ways. I don't want to kind of go down that rabbit hole, but there are different ways of calculating the income limits based on different household size calculations. So HUD publishes it all. But basically, that's just showing what they're actually charging for their 60% AMI restricted units. And then fair market rent is the purple.
I love that chart. I do.
So, okay,
Oh,
so, wait, so,
Sure.
so the yellow is 60% AMI.
Yes, correct.
So anything beneath the yellow is like clearly affordable supply.
It's affordable, but not. It's
Not restricted.
Correct. It's conventional product, but technically falls beneath the affordable threshold.
And how, so, well, I guess for the 2 and 3 bedroom, we don't have very much.
Sure. It just depends it depends on, what you're considering affordable. So 60%, is here. There's not very much, but if you were to bring it up to 80% AMI, about half of the supply would fall beneath it.
Why is fair market rent at the bottom?
Fair market rent is a calculation by HUD that most people in the industry think is kind of garbage. So,
Yeah, it does not seem to be
yeah.
relevant.
yeah. It's also at the countywide level, so it's gonna be skewed
Oh.
downward. There's also something called small area fair market rent. It's not really used in many HUD programs, but that then seeks to kind of look more to, it's at the zip code level, so HUD's trying to refine it, but it's not great.
Yeah, I mean, this is valuable too, but I mean, to me, it's confusing to, like, if you don't really like the fair market value number, I would take it out. And the orange I find confusing too. The last version I saw just had the green and
Sure.
the yellow.
Well, and it's also, I mean, it's taken in context within like a 300-page report too.
I know,
so.
but I mean, like, we've read the report and gone through presentations, and most people aren't gonna do that, so, and then, like, I mean, I've already used the donut graph you have of income renters versus owners. I forget where I brought it up, I think at the, human relations. So some of the graphs and the stuff you're doing are being used in other contexts and are gonna be really relevant to things that we're talking about in studies that are having to do with other things, so that's why I'm asking you to kind of not, try to make them less confusing, because they're probably gonna be taken out of this report and used other ways, so some of that complexity is like gonna make them less useful for other purposes. Do you know what I'm
Sure.
saying?
Yeah, sure, yep.
Alright, so this is moving into sort of the supply portion of the questions that were posed. So, what is the nature and extent of housing demand in Shorewood, including residents currently living in Shorewood and non-residents who may want to live in the community? What aspects of housing demand does Shorewood supply currently not meet, such as affordable, accessible, price, size, number of bedrooms, special supportive needs? So basically, what this is taking is all of the data from HUD that categorizes households by different thresholds and the number of units that are available at each of those, that would be affordable at each of those income thresholds, and calculates the number of available units per 100 renter households. So it's a fairly complex calculation. There are some really nice charts in the report that are, fairly simple, like on a bar graph that kind of show, so you can see basically what the key takeaway is that the kind of what I was talking about earlier with the naturally occurring affordable housing. Basically, there are not sufficient available and affordable units for the lower income cohorts within Shorewood, which is very typical of most communities. So essentially what this is saying is for, say, households that are at or below 80% of AMI, which is the bottom portion of the table, that there are only 59 affordable and available units per 100 renter households. So that means there's just a deficit of households. So theoretically, you would want that number to be at or close to 100. So all that is saying is that, there are essentially more units within the market that could potentially be targeted to those households, but they tend to be occupied by households that are earning at a much higher level, so effectively sort of displacing the amount of available units for those in lower income households. This just does the same analysis for owners, same sort of thing, except the numbers here indicate an even slightly greater deficit. So again, looking at that category, and for owners, we've brought it up to 100% of area median family income, just based upon how owners tend to be distributed. And there are only affordable and available units of 40 per 100 owner households.
What gives us the deficit? The demand, or just based upon?
So it's based upon the number of renters that you have within the community at that income threshold, and then the number of available units at, so HUD determines affordable as not paying more than 30% of your income towards rent or housing costs. So it is just looking at the number of households within each category and then comparing it to the number of rental or owner units that would basically be an appropriate match for that category, so that a household would not have to pay more than 30% of their income.
So hypothetically, if that 485 was brought into line to zero, then the previous graph that showed, what was it called, where the excessive housing costs, overburdened households would be reduced. That's the takeaway.
Yes,
from
so
this?
if there was less of
It would
a
be
deficit,
overburdened.
correct,
Would go
they're
down.
all tied together, this is all sort of
I
from the
see,
same data set. It's basically, I mean, the primary thing that's driving this is just, and we'll kind of talk about this a little bit more, is in somewhat due to the fact that the market is so supply constrained, that just by sort of default, you have households at higher income thresholds residing in the housing that is available, which in many cases is housing that for those higher income households is quote unquote even more affordable to them. So you just end up with a situation where those in the lower income cohorts just don't have as much available housing for them to reside in, because those in higher income groups are residing in more of those homes.
So there's a deficit of high income rental properties actually.
You could look at it that way.
Or there's this conscious choice by people to
There's
live
just,
affordably.
yeah, there's
Or
just
it's a
limited,
definite-
there's just
a deficit
limited
of
supply.
housing.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, there's just limited supply overall.
I
Okay.
mean, that's what's driving prices, I mean,
Mhm.
supply and demand.
When you say affordable and available
Mhm.
units, do you mean available like for sale now? Is that what available means?
Meaning affordable and available to a household within that cohort. So meaning that that unit is affordable and not already occupied by someone at that higher income threshold.
So for those units like that are required to be at some percent of AMI or whatever,
Mhm.
there's no requirement that the actual tenant meets some income threshold, or doesn't meet some income threshold, I should say?
You mean for the mandated
Yeah, so
housing?
it's available at a reduced rate, but anyone, no matter how rich they are, can get into that place? 'Cause-
No, so if it's mandated housing, which Shorewood really doesn't have much of, but if it's mandated housing, then depending on the program, there are income qualifications and then rent restrictions. So